Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review, where we use our AI, Design Eye, to analyse a design of mine and give us some feedback on the principles and elements of design, the way we would normally be judged in competitions, and some suggestions for improvement. This week we are looking at a design that had the title "It's Easy Being Green." And fortuitously, I am also wearing green for you today. It wasn't a choice that I made consciously, but it's worked out well in terms of this video. For the whole of the time that I was planning this design, I had in my head the Kermit the Frog song, "It's Not Easy Being Green." And so I did this whole design based on the fact that it was not easy being green. And then a week before the competition realised that I had been reading it the wrong way the whole time. And so I quickly adjusted the design so that I utilised just tints, tones and shades of green to highlight the fact that it was easy to have a green arrangement from your garden in a competition of sorts. This is a local regional competition, agricultural show. It has a long history of being involved with floral art over decades, probably, of locals, both florists and flower growers, because we're in an area where for some period of time there were flowers grown for the local markets. And the judging of the competition generally falls to whoever's handy at the time, which is often the case with these sorts of shows. So I wasn't particularly expecting anything out of the competition, but I wanted something to be on the bench because it is a draw card for the local community, and it was a new coordinator that had taken over. She was very enthusiastic and had great plans for increasing the displays and the standard of display for the floral art section. She is a commercial florist, but in her early days she had been a competitor as a junior florist. And so she wanted to encourage other students and people early in their careers in floristry to enter competitions and get a feel for the different ways that they could design apart from doing it commercially. So to support her and to support the local community, I said that I would enter some designs. And so this is my design for Easy Being Green. I think judging on the day brought it in second, and I really wasn't concerned, because all I wanted, as I said, was for something interesting to be on the bench, something that was different, but something that had come from the garden as well. That wasn't a prerequisite, but I thought it would be an added bonus for people locally to see that they could use things that they had grown themselves. The coordinator was mortally embarrassed after the competition that I didn't win, and I said to her at the time that I wasn't worried and I wasn't expecting feedback. So it's very good, because I don't think that's an unusual circumstance for you not to get feedback from competitions. So it's very good that we have now this service for art review where you can get feedback on your designs without anyone else hearing it or seeing it or knowing about it. And so I've put this design through our AI, Design Eye, and we've got some feedback about the design based on the principles and elements of design, which is how you should design anyway. But it is what should be used for competition judging, but it's also a good discipline for you to get into when you're planning your designs as well. And we've also got some suggestions for improving the design. So let's dive straight into that and see what it's got to say. I should say, first of all, the space allowed was 50 centimetres, yes, because there's not a whole lot of bench display area in the shed where these things go, and it was judged from the front. So now let's have a look at what our AI Design Eye had to say. Colour, first of all, and the reason that it has chosen to put colour as the first of the feedback is because there is a colour mentioned in the title. So whenever you've got a colour or a choice of colours, so it might say just using one colour rather than specify a colour, you need to ensure that you use only tints, tones and shades of that colour. And that does make it actually easier to design, because there's such a range of things that you can find in one colour. What you have to be careful of, though, is that without a variety of colours, if you're a person who relies on colour contrast, you're going to have to think of some other way to have contrast in the design. Now for me that's not an issue because, as you know, texture is my go-to contrast element. So let's see what it says about colour. A masterclass in a monochromatic palette. You have successfully navigated the varying shades, tints and tones of a single hue, bridging the pastel mint of the vintage tea canister with the vibrant lime of the Banksias and the deep rich greens of the foliage. So the foliage that I've used there, there's a little bit of conifer, there's parsley, because it's an agricultural show and I thought I'd throw that in as well, still plant material, and the natural foliage from the Banksias and also from the kangaroo form. Texture, because colour contrast is entirely removed, as I talked about, texture must do all the heavy lifting. The interplay here is excellent. The cold, smooth metal of the tin sits against the velvet fuzz of the kangaroo paw, the harsh, wiry spikes of the Banksia and the dense, ruffled crinkles of the parsley. So we've got texture, but what we've also got is subtle textural differences. So the tin is smooth and shiny. The leaves of the Banksia are also smooth and they're up against the smooth of the tin, but they are matte. And so there's already a contrast in terms of just the smooth texture is contrasted by being both matte and shiny, and they're together against one another. So I get that contrast happening there because I can't rely on the colour contrast. There is a contrast in colours between the dark and the light of the green, but it's not enough to be a real focal area in terms of contrast. So there needs to be something that's a bit more of a hero in terms of contrast, and for me in this design that's texture, and for most designs I hear you say line. The tall stems of the kangaroo paw provide essential upward reaching diagonal and vertical lines. These lines give the arrangement dynamic life and prevent the lower mass of foliage from feeling like a static heavy block. If you can imagine, if you take away, just put your hand over the image and take away the height that is provided by those kangaroo paw, what we are left with is a very different design. It's a much broader horizontal design, and whilst we can still draw a triangle between the top of that design and the base, it's not as impressive a design, and it certainly is a much heavier design than if we use the kangaroo paw as the top of our triangle and then bring the sides of the triangle down. So we've got a much better area of movement, we've got height, and the other thing too with not using the kangaroo paw would be that the container would be fairly close to being the same proportion as the plant material itself, and the container should always be less than the rest of the plant material. Form. The design utilises an asymmetrical mass form. It feels lush, abundant and natural, perfectly suiting the casual vintage vibe of the container. So the form of your design is the shape and the presentation of it. Now if I had had something that was a more traditional design, so had, still use the Banksias but had them as a central mass as the focal point and had some smaller flowers around them and sort of gradually drew it out so that within the tea canister it was very much more a symmetrical and traditional design. The canister is going to look out of place because it's not a formal enough container for the design that is resting on it. So you've always got to think about, in terms of your container, that it is part of the design, it is part of the form and the shape of your design, and you really need to think about when you've decided on what plant material you want to use that best going to tell the story of your class title, then you need to think about, have I got or can I make, more often than not, a container that is going to work with this. And what I could have used, if I didn't use the green canister, I could have used just a little pyramid almost of branches or of leaves. I could have manipulated some leaves underneath it so it just looked like it was coming out of leaves and not had any visible container at all. The plant material is inside the container, is in a glass jar, because the natives work better when they're in clean water rather than floral foam, and I'll talk about that probably a little bit later. But the idea of thinking about your container needs to come second when you're planning your design. Too often, when we've been doing it for a little while, we think, oh, I've got that container, I'll use that container, and I will make the design work with the container. That's just not going to get you to the same level as thinking about the design as a whole and thinking about the container as being part of the design, not what the design sits on or in. Unity. The strict adherence to the all-green palette, including the container, creates an immediate and powerful sense of cohesion. So once again, it's about incorporating the container into the design, just as I talked about, that it has to form a complete unit. It all has to tell the story. You certainly can't rely on the container telling the story. The plant material needs to be telling the story, but the plant material also needs to be obviously able to get a water source if it needs to for the duration of the show. And that in turn leads you to start thinking about how you can incorporate something that is a container into your designs. Now, for me, because I like texture and I like more sculptural elements in my designs, I have moved away from manufactured containers to more natural things. So I'll often use Banksia rounds or bark or piled up twigs as my containers and hide the water sources inside those and have those as what is part of the design. And so for me, I found a way to make my containers unified within the design. So just another thing for you to think about in your floral art journey. Contrast. The visual interest is achieved purely through the juxtaposition of different plant shapes, such as broad, solid leaves placed next to delicate, spindly foliage. So the contrast is not just in texture alone, but it is, as I talked about earlier, is in terms of the placement of those different textures and where they work, and also about the, to a lesser extent, contrast of forms, shapes, because the shape of the kangaroo paw flowers is different to the Banksias, but overall, we're still maintaining, yes, we're maintaining the green, but we're also maintaining a circular form. So contrast has to come in some way within those parameters of the colour and of the form of the design. Balance. The asymmetrical balance is at the base. The asymmetrical balance at the base is very well handled. The T-tin lid resting intentionally on the left side brilliantly counterweighs the visual mass of the large Banksia resting over the rim on the right. Now, this was a very intentional placement of mine. I didn't want to just have the plant placement inside the canister. I wanted it to be obviously a canister because without the lid, it would just look like a bunch of flowers in a vase. If we bring it down to its very basic level. So to have the lid there adds a little bit of different interest, but it's not a drawing point. It's not a focal point because I've got the leaf coming over the top of it. And again, that gave us the contrast of the two smooth textures with the shiny and a matte finish. And so I incorporated that into the design. And that contrast against one another brings the lid into the design with the placement of the leaves above it. And it does also balance the placements on the other side, as it has said, visually. Proportion. The height of the plant material relates beautifully to the container, filling the space without dwarfing the vintage tin. So because we've got quite a large mass across the top of the tin, we do need that height to give us those balanced proportions. And I talked about earlier about drawing the triangle. And if you took away the kangaroo paw and just had the Banksia placements and arrangements there across the top of the tin, it's not going to be, it would still be an acceptable design, but it's not going to be as visually balanced or as visually in scale and proportion as it is with those taller placements, and certainly you wouldn't get the movement in it that you get with the taller placements as well. So let's now have a look at some of the suggestions, 2 suggestions we've got this week for improving the design. First of all, the transitional stepping. The shift from the dense massed foliage at the rim of the container to the tall airy kangaroo paw stems is slightly abrupt. Introducing a mid-height transition element, perhaps another piece of native foliage with a strong shape, could step the viewer's eye up more smoothly into the vertical lines. That's probably true, and I think probably what I could go with is some just thinking what I could use. I could use the Xanthorrhoea, the grass tree leaves, because they're quite spiky and flat and thin, and I could vary the heights of those, and they do have a little bit of a curl over, so that would work. There is some. So I'm just thinking what else is green, but the coastal rosemary is quite a nice native one, and it would give me small flowers, but they're white, and I wouldn't want to introduce another colour into the design, so I couldn't use those. So worth thinking about, worth trying out a few things, but I think the suggestion of the foliage, the thinner foliage, is probably the thing that would work best for me, because there is thin foliage which is very often very hard to see on the kangaroo paw, and I wouldn't want to manipulate any foliage, so I could have a gymea leaf, but because they're so broad I'd have to cut it down and shape it, and that introduces a different element that is more a manipulated element, and everything else is very naturally placed and very naturally geared towards it being looking like something that you just gathered up and placed in the container, which is what I wanted as well. So the second suggestion is about focal reinforcement. The lowest banksia rests beautifully on the rim, drawing the eye down to the word T. However, to strengthen the central focal area, angling that banksia slightly upward or grouping a second one just slightly above and behind it would anchor the centre of the design more firmly. And I think that's exactly right. I can see that there's this gap between the banksia that is closest to the word T and the next one up. There's a gap there, and I need to have something in that gap. And something, as it says, something deep in, not something that is at that same level as those 2 banksias. And moving that lower banksia to turn upwards would mean that you could see more of the tin, and I don't want the tin to dominate the view when you look at the design, so I want the plant material to drape over it so that it is part of the design rather than, as I said earlier, container and plant material on top. There we have our analysis of Easy Being Green, and some suggestions for improvement and some thoughts along the way about what I was doing and what I could do to improve it. I hope that has given you some ideas and some things to think about with your own designs. It is very much a learning process always. And so I do encourage you to visit Floral Art Review. It's a very simple process to upload an image of yours. You get feedback within about 15 seconds, but certainly within a minute, and then you've got it there forever until you close that particular account. It is about you having a portfolio that you can refer back to when you think about a design. You think, well, I did that on that design. What did it say that time that I needed to do to make that better? You can always go back to it. The feedback that you get will have the image that you've uploaded, plus all of this kind of breakdown against the principles and elements of design, and some suggestions for you to bring the design a bit more forward than it is when it's being presented to the AI for its analysis. I will leave you this week to think about how easy it is being green. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.